This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, Mullen Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Jeanelle Hope, who teaches in and is director of the program in African American Studies at Prairie View A&M University. In this conversation, we discuss the anti-fascist theory and practice in the Black studies tradition, comparative racial and ethnic study, and the importance of critical theoretical work in the history and future of the field. Good morning, Jeanelle. How are you today?
I'm doing well, and yourself, John?
Man, we were talking before I hit record. It is so hot and humid here, but I'm in the air conditioning.
And we are thankful and blessed for that.
And it's still the morning time, so the house has not heated up. My spouse and I were leaving the house yesterday, and she looked and she said, "The house looks hot." I was like, "Yeah, from the outside." But I'm really happy to have you on the podcast. So welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm excited to hear what you have to say about your work, about the field, and all of that. And I will just say, publicly on this recording, also thank you for being patient with my really shaky correspondence this summer. I was not a great correspondent.
It's all good. It's the summer. Us faculty members don't always do the best.
Yeah, I should.
Email over the summer. It's when you do get a break. So I'm happy to be here and really respect the work that you all are doing in terms of documenting the field, and faculty that are doing some really amazing work, scholars that are doing some amazing work inside and outside the academy with regards to Black studies.
I appreciate that. Ashley and I started this as a like a heart project, and it's turned into what we really think of as like an important documentation of the field. And I think you're scheduled to be 160 or 161 in the series, so we've really accumulating a lot of history.
I've been busy. Yeah.
But really happy to have your perspective, and we'll get a chance, of course, to talk about how you understand the field of Black studies or imagine the field of Black studies and the kind of work you do in relation to it. But I wanted to start before we get into those kinds of questions with a more personal question, and just ask you, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And always for me, an interesting sort of companion question with that, which is what sustains you and keeps you committed in relation to this kind of work?
So this is a really easy question for me. Black studies is home, both quite literally, and then, of course, in terms of the work more figuratively. So I'm from Oakland, California. I'm from where Black studies was born.
Mm-hmm.
When I went to high school, I did high school and community college at the same time at a place called Contra Costa College. One of my first history professors was an African American studies professor at Contra Costa College, and her name was Carolyn Hodge. She was among the first generation of Black studies students to come out of San Francisco State's Black Studies Department.
Oh, wow.
And so very early in my upbringing, I won't even say a career, but very early in my education, this is like sophomore, junior year of high school, I learned about the Third World Liberation Front. I understood what it meant to be from the Bay Area and the type of student organizing and activism that really brought about Black studies. And that was just made incredibly legible in my classes every day as I took classes with Professor Hodge. And so I'm really blessed in that regard to come out of a space and a tradition where Black studies has its origins, not just Black studies, but Black studies and ethnic studies has its origins. And there have just been generations of folks that were in the space that poured into me as a young person at the high school level, at the community college level. And so the Third World Liberation Front, the student strike, Nathan Hare, those aren't things that I just teach and like read about and write about. Like, that's where I'm from. And so
Wow.
Black studies is home because Oakland is home, and because so many of the folks that I've been in community with have fought so hard to ensure the discipline is both institutionalized, but also remains at the sort of grassroots and community level. And so early on, I knew I wanted to be within the Black study space because I wanted to be like Professor Hodge. And I also understood the value of Black studies very early, because it was the discipline that was both telling me about myself, right, in the past and the present, but also gave me the opportunity to imagine, what does Black life in Oakland look like in the future, in the Bay Area in the future. And so the types of questions that you're able to ask within the field really sort of drew me in. The pedagogy that I saw Professor Hodge, engaged in was different than what I saw from other professors. I enjoyed, at the time I didn't understand it, but the interdisciplinarity of Black studies. And so, Black studies is home. And it's informed so much of my work, both in California and beyond, both in the academy and outside of the academy, but really in thinking about a lot of my work in California. As I mentioned, high school, I'm in Black studies classes. And this isn't abnormal for Black folks and young folks growing up in the Bay Area. Berkeley High's had a Black Studies program for years, right? Again, thinking about its sort of those connections to UC Berkeley and the sort of student activism of the 60s. And then when I did get to UC Davis, where I was working on my PhD in cultural studies, I've been brought back into the work. I'd been someone who was helping to advocate for the passage of AB 2016, which was the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, which we won, which was a California high school graduation requirement that every high schooler has to take ethnic studies class. I will go on to work at the California Department of Education on their Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, right? And so I've been just taught across the board by really dynamic ethnic studies and Black studies professors throughout my journey. And it really starts at home, being in Oakland and understanding the rich history of that space as sort of a birthplace for not just Black studies, but many other overlapping movements that have informed the field.
So I hope that people, there's an Oakland contingent listening to this episode of the podcast, because they're going to love that. As a person with multi-generational family roots in Southern California, there's a sports rivalry there. But
oh yeah,
there, my dad was stabbed multiple times at Oakland Stadium at the World Series. But anyway, we won't get into that. I have a little resentment around Oakland with that. But
Lord.
People are rough.
They are.
But there is no peer really with the Bay Area when it comes to the origins of Black studies. And I love hearing you recount that and talk about how it's continued to have that life, not just as an institution of study, but as a at the college or graduate school level, but really, like you said, just as a part of everyday life and part of K through 12 in this case. I know it's a junior college program, but still a K through 12. That's wonderful. We should get people on who work on this stuff in Berkeley high school system on the podcast. I would love that. We'll talk separately about that, but these are perspectives we absolutely want on the podcast. I'm curious just to follow up just a little bit and hear, like, how did that work that you did as a high school student follow you into college? I mean, you talked about it shaping, like, both your work and your sort of political, classroom work and political work in graduate school. But how did this moment of your high school experience follow you into college? Because I just think about how many of these podcasts have been like people having questions that they didn't really have a chance to sort of understand the depths and expansive modes of inquiry, et cetera, until they got to college. But you're sort of talking about sort of arriving at college with this really rich sense of what Black studies is and what the study of Black life would be.
Yeah. So coming out of high school, so with that program, you graduate with like an AA and a high school diploma at the same time. And so my AA was actually in African American studies, probably one of my more proudest degrees that I have. Um, and so from that, I had already been sort of steeped in thinking about colonization, right? Professor Hodge was introducing me to folks like Asa Hilliard. We were reading, They Came Before Columbus, a la more of a sort of Africana tradition, and we'll get to that, like the different disidentifications within the field. But I was being introduced to very complex sort of themes and concepts within the discipline very early. I'll say that, of course, it takes some reading and rereading, and it isn't really until I get to like later in my undergrad, more so in my master's program, that I'm able to like sit and fully like understand and be like, it becomes more full circle, right? So coming out of that program in high school, I really had a leg up, right? Because I took pretty much all of my lower division AFAM classes at the community college level. And so when I went to Cal State Long Beach for my undergrad degree. Was trained by Milana Karenga and Dr. Larice Hubbard, Dr. Mandy. So very much a tradition of folks who were of a temple Africana. I think now they go by like Africology kind of vein of Black studies. And so I have a little bit of a leg up coming in. And so I'm able to sit with like Kawaii womanism. I think I would later come to like Black feminism later in my grad career. I was able to sit with questions of cultural nationalism and Black nationalism a little bit more. And thankfully, I've come from two Black studies spaces, thinking about that high school moment as well as that undergrad moment at Cal State Long Beach, where, for better or worse, they were very much interwoven with a broader ethnic studies space. So I was going to undergrad leading up to the '08 financial crisis. And what that meant at the level of higher ed in California was that there was a lot of consolidations of departments. And so I vividly remember we were undergoing some consolidation between the Black and ethnic studies spaces. And so, yes, it was a forced sort of like meshing that had to happen, but it also was natural in ways. And so I've always been steeped in Black studies, certainly from a perspective of grappling with anti-Blackness, but also trying to think about what does third worldism look like. And we'll get to my research on like Afro-Asian solidarity a little bit. And so it's been really important for me to come out of Black study spaces, or excuse me, be in Black study spaces that have had a relationship to the broader ethnic study space. I have been blessed to have really great Chicana, mentors. Angie back at UC Davis. I've been blessed to have really great Asian American mentors that also do Black studies work, like Diane Fugino at UC Santa Barbara and Robin Rodriguez. And so that has also been part of my journey. And I think it's very California.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
It's a very California style of Black studies and ethnic studies work. And it again takes me back to home. It's because of that Third World Liberation Front and sort of this moment of solidarity that we oftentimes point to that really births the field. And so for me, Black studies is home, but it's also about solidarity.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'd like to, whenever possible, have sort of intra-podcast reference, but just maybe a couple of podcasts prior to yours coming out will be the one with Solgi Lee, who teaches at University of South Carolina, who works on Afro-Asian stuff, and also California PhD. And I do think that California experience and distinctiveness is so rich and important. Yeah, it's good. We sort of stumbled into a sort of cluster here, or at least a pairing of people working on this kind of thing. Now, you've already, in some ways, started to have a response to this question, but I'll ask it. And this is how you. understand or imagine the field of Black studies, what's the portrait you work with? And I always ask this question in the context of its origin, right, which was a demand that by students that there be a place on campuses for the study of Black life, right? That disciplines weren't doing this work, and that a Black studies program and department would do exactly that sort of thing. And that's that part of Black studies that's cultivated such a rich and expansive vision of an intellectual tradition. But of course, as you yourself were already discussing, that the origins of Black studies, right, takes place at this moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, where so many of these boundaries between study and action, between campus and community, between books and guns, right, for lack of a better way of putting it, those distinctions started to collapse. And I think one of the legacies of that has been Black studies having also at the heart of its meaning a political commitment to a certain kind of prescriptive dimension. And so that prescriptive politics and that descriptive engagement with an intellectual tradition, this sort of the founding of Black studies has both of those in play at once. And I think that's still with us today as we sort of wrestle with the question of what is Black studies, that we're pulled in both of these directions. And there's a tension between those. It's not a contradiction, but there's a tension. And sort of in that framing, I'm interested in hearing you talk about what portrait of the field you work with. What's your imagination of the field 55 years after its founding?
Yeah, I think you get at it. Like, first and foremost, Black studies is about the study of Black life, past, present, and future, right? To borrow from bell hooks, it's about bringing the dynamic experiences of Black life across space and time from sort of margin to center, right? I think that's first and foremost what we do. Second, a sort of mission, not a sort of, the mission of Black studies is also to serve as a type of political education that gets students and broader sort of publics and audiences that we're engaging through our work to really interrogate power, right? I find that at the root of most of my work, it's about interrogating power, whether that be through the lens of race, through the lens of colonization, through the lens of, or as I've been talking a lot more about, like fascism and anti-fascism, through capitalism, right? We're thinking about sort of political economies more broadly, right? Black studies provides us the space really to ask these big questions around power and how it impacts the Black experience, right? And so that's what I'm always trying to get my students in the classroom to do, is to ask big questions, right? To ask, how did we get to these outcomes? What are the sort of systems and structures that are in place that animate that? And how does that connect to sort of larger conceptions of power, right? I think third, for me, Black studies is always about dreaming of freedom and practicing the work of liberating oneself and one's people. So it's always about liberation. And so it's about figuring out, depending upon what moment we are in, what does freedom work look like, right? What does the next iteration of activism look like? So it's looking forward and trying to understand, what do we need in this particular moment to free ourselves from whatever it is, the power structure that we just talked about a little bit earlier, right? But it's also looking backwards and figuring out, okay, what are the different tools of freedom fighting and liberation making that were employed that we might be able to bring to the present or adapt for the present, right? I think sort of fourth for me, Black studies, what makes Black studies different from any other discipline is that it comes out of, yes, student activism, but really it comes out of community, right? And so Black studies must always be community engaged. It must always return back to the people to see, not only to study, but to figure out, how do we use the resources that we have? How do we use the scholarship that we have to be able to not only improve our communities, but we also have to have this sort of reciprocal relationship where our community is also informing the work in which we are doing, right? And we have to be open to that and not come in and try to be prescriptive, but understand. And this has come up in my research so many times. Like I'm thinking about a grant project from some time ago, coming in, wanted to do this oral history project, with some Black girls in Sacramento, so, Black and Asian American girls out of Sacramento, some who were, dealing with gang violence, all kinds of like street violence and truancy and all the sorts of things that they're marked and labeled as. And I want to come in and I want to do this. And it's actually not that. Part of it is, yeah, we're going to do oral history, but a lot of it is, oh, y'all just need space to talk and like understand and find vocabulary for what you experience, but also to sit with those questions of power, right? Especially as it comes to issues around violence in sort of divested communities, Black and AAPI communities that have been over-policed. So y'all need to think about power. And we also need to figure out, like, what does sort of freedom fighting look like in this moment? And so a lot of that class became that, right? And it was a pivot that I had to embrace. And so I find myself doing that a lot in my work. You may come in with one thing and you might get to do a piece of it, but being community engaged means that you are always open and flexible for what the community tells you is needed and what the community tells you or informs you on that's happening, and figuring out, okay, how do we get ready to support? How do we mobilize to be in this struggle? And then I'll say, finally, one of the final pieces that I think about in terms of being like pivotal to Black studies is pedagogy. I come from a family of teachers, mostly K-12, well, exclusively K-12 teachers. My aunt is a principal. I've grown up seeing her walk classrooms and hallways, always been in somebody's classroom. And it's not just about learning from me. I always enjoyed watching teachers teach. And I remember my Auntie Joan, when I was young, she knew that I enjoyed this. And so she let me teach Sunday school. And so one thing that I have come to love about Black studies is that I love how we teach. Not all of us are good teachers. Some faculty are trash.
Yeah,
and not
human beings
necessarily
in the
very
classroom.
student-centered and are very much more research-focused. But there's a way that we teach because the discipline tells us that, we're working with folks sometimes who are on the margins of the margins. We're working with folks, especially when you get to some of these D1 institutions, you're working with young Black boys and Black men who are coming in with 4th, 3rd grade reading level, but they play really good football. But at the same time, you want to inform them about power, and to be able to ask questions about the things that they are experiencing on this very affluent campus, right? And so Black studies is also thinking about how do we reach new generations, older generations of people within the discipline. What does that mean? Oftentimes, I don't teach from a textbook, right? It's only been as of, recently that folks are, the mainstream publishers are even interested in putting together types of Black studies textbooks, right? So there isn't this sort of prescriptive, this is how we teach. We oftentimes are creating our own pedagogy, thinking through, what does assignment look like, and pushing back on some of the type of disciplining that comes from higher education, the sort of structures that exist, that keep our sort of departments in sort of uniformity. But also thinking about how do we get students to be engaged within community through assignments? What does lecturing look like? Is lecturing always necessary? How do we get students to teach themselves, right? I think back to I was taught by Dr. Mugo at Syracuse, and she called herself a mwalimu, which is a Kenyan or Swahili word for, teacher, but it really doesn't mean to teach. It means to like facilitate the dissemination of knowledge, right? And so I oftentimes think about like, how can I help facilitate these students learning from each other? And so I take pedagogy very seriously because I feel like it's something that comes out in Black studies as we think very critically about how do we reach people, knowing that what we want to accomplish goes beyond just, here's a diploma, right? We are really trying to cultivate critical thinkers, folks who will be, the next generation of freedom fighters in whatever sort of avenue it is that they pursue, and so that requires a lot in terms of sitting with your own pedagogical practice.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear you talk about pedagogy as central to the not just teaching like as a separate thing, but to the very idea of Black studies. I know when Ashley listens to this, she'll be very happy. So hello, Ashley. This is exactly what she and I talk about all the time. It's absolutely crucial to I agree to the very idea of Black studies. So thank you for speaking to that. And let me just make then a shift, because I mean you've worked sort of into this question already. Sort of given how you were talking about the field of Black studies, I'm interested to hear you talk about your own research, which is interested in you did a cultural studies PhD, so cultural sensibilities, political theory, critical work on race, comparative work as well on race and nation, and so there's so much to see inside that frame in terms of Black studies questions. And I'm interested how you think your work and your orientation that way relates to the past of Black studies. How is it a part of that, of the tradition, but also what new horizons does it open up and what boundaries do you think it pushes for the field?
Oh, good question. Good question. All right. So Black studies is home. I'm Black studies through and through. One thing that Black studies has taught me is that another thing that Black studies has taught me is that I'm going to do the work that I want to do and that my community tells me that I need to do. And so for me, it's never been about like, oh, this is this one project and I'm going to see it through for 30 years. No, I have some deep investment in projects, but there are moments where the work drags me in different directions. And so you listen and you follow. So my research is sort of two-pronged at the moment as an independent scholar. In my PhD program and in my master's program in Syracuse, I began studying Afro-Asian solidarity. This was a question that came about from my upbringing. I've always lived at the intersection of Black and Asian American communities in the Bay Area. I've always been interested in how there, in some cases, these sort of hybrid identities that emerge from folks living in these very sort of close nexus across California, but especially in the Bay Area. I've always been interested in really teasing through sort of the mainstream media projection of Black Asian conflict, right? But also grappling with like actual Black Asian conflict that does exist. But also, coming out of a space and knowing that the Bandung Conference happened. There is this sort of non-aligned movement that happens where China and many African countries are aligned during the sort of immediate post-World War II era. There is this recognition of the Third World Liberation Front and Richard Aoki giving the Black Panther Party some of their first guns. And so I wanted to really sit with that history because for me, not only is it a question of what does solidarity look like, but in the moment, it helps inform, okay, how can we get these two groups of folks, these two communities, to be in better community with one another, particularly as we've been talking about Stop Asian Hate. I've been living in Sacramento and seeing some of the Black Asian AAPI tension there, even within schools that I had been working in with Black and Asian American youth. And so, yeah, so my first project is, what does Afro-Asian solidarity look like? I situate myself in sort of post-civil rights era uh, California, particularly in the Bay Area. I'm looking at how particularly the Black Panther Party is working with the Red Guards in San Francisco, and also different groups that are emerging out of Berkeley. So particularly the Asian American Political Alliance, APA. And so much of my research sort of tracks that. I also turn to, I'm a cultural studies girl, so I love poetry, and I'm looking through sort of the Asian American movement that's happening and the Black Power movement that's happening. And I'm seeing within similar spaces, poetry is used as a form of activism, or what I talk about is artivism. And so I'm looking at how this sort of Black arts movement poetry is taking similar shape as a sort of Asian American poetry is during this sort of 1960s and 1970s period. So it's looking at, on the ground, what does solidarity look like between the Panthers and these groups, but also within these sort of poetic spaces, how is the writing also sort of converging as a type of solidarity with regards to talking about, anti-Vietnam War sentiments, talking about various types of liberation movements that are happening across the global South, talking about obviously instances of police brutality and divestment that are happening within these communities. And so that's the first iteration of my project. While I'm in the archive, and the archive will send you, I come across this major conference that the Black Panther Party hosts in July of 1969. Gonna let my dog go upstairs. I come across this major conference that the Black Panther Party hosts July 1969 at Little Bobby Hutton Park, or what they call Defremery Park. And it's called the United Front Against Fascism Conference. I was not prepared in any kind of way to deal with fascism as a type of political thought in my master's program. But I had so much on it that I knew, I was like, I'm going to come back to this. So I go through my grad work. Everything is very Afro-Asian, getting to studying Grace Lee Boggs, looking at sort of Afro-Asian solidarity in education spaces up in Detroit between her and James and Grace Lee Boggs. Really, really, really lovely work. Fast forward, I graduate and we see the reemergence of the far right. I began to sort of take up questions, and we start to see the word, fascism sort of float. I was really interested in interrogating how Black people, both in the U.S. and across the diaspora, have engaged in anti-fascist movements. I knew this wasn't just something contemporary, but this was something historical as well. And so I was also very deeply engaged in organizing and activism as well during this sort of period. And so I was in the spaces. So I wrote a piece about a Black anti-fascist sort of, not quite a tradition, but gesturing towards it, saying that anti-fascism isn't something that Black people have just talked about, in this moment, but it is something that Black people have long discussed, going back to Amy Césaire, going back to Frantz Fanon, going back to Ida B. Wells, going back to that July 1969 conference called the United Front Against Fascism Conference held in Oakland, where over 5,000 people came, and they named fascism
5,000?
as over 5,000 people came, and they said the greatest threat against, folks of color in the country was fascism in 1969. Right. And so that project, that piece, that small article that I did blew up. And I was like, oh, this is the book. And I didn't say that. Somebody else told me that. Multiple people told me, like, this is the book. And I was like, I do have these manila folders of like archival stuff that I haven't really done enough work with. Maybe I'll revisit it, And I did. And so I came out with a co-authored book with Bill Mullen last year called The Black Anti-Fascist Tradition, Fighting Back from Anti-Lynching to Abolition. And so in it, we take up Amy Césaire's call that the roots of fascism lie in the barbarisms of colonialism excised on folks in Africa and Latin America, but particularly in Africa. We chart this sort of arc of how Black people from Césaire to Ida B. Wells, to Harry Haywood, to Langston Hughes, to Assata Shakur, to Robert F. Williams, to Du Bois, to William Patterson, are all engaging fascism and talking about fascism in their work, right? So this isn't something new, right? Black people have long talked. Ida B. Wells is comparing the experience of lynchings to the pogroms that are happening to Russian Jews in her 2 pamphlets on lynchings, Red Record and Southern Horror. You have Amy Césaire talking about colonialism is fascism just excised on Europeans. You have Harry Haywood who's talking about the Chicago race riot and is calling it a pogrom, a Holocaust. You have one of my favorite Langston Hughes poems where he's saying what's happening in Beaumont, Texas is eerily familiar to what is happening in interwar Europe, right? And so for us, we're arguing that, Europe during this interwar, World War I, World War II period, they don't get to have a monopoly on what is fascism. And it actually isn't the birthplace of fascism, right? And it is actually Black folks who are arguing that fascism predates this period, right? And are really outlining what fascism is in their writings, and have been organizing against fascism much early, right? I think that connection is really strengthened, obviously, via sort of the Double Victory or Double V campaign. Has made it very legible, and that fighting for victory at home and abroad, right? This sort of comparison that happens within the African-American newspapers, the Pittsburgh Courier and the sorts. But beyond Black folks going and literally fighting on the front lines in Spain, in, Germany against fascism, they also are fighting against the type of homegrown fascism that they're outlining, or a type of fascism that they're identifying within the colonies themselves. And so that's what our work does, is it outlines this sort of arc of how Black folks have been talking about fascism for so long. It's a tradition, right? But also have been fighting against it. And so they've been leveraging the courts. They've been, leveraging different types of campaigns. We really situate ourselves in that We Charge Genocide campaign. I don't know if you're familiar with that William Patterson in the 1950s attempts to charge the U.S. with genocide based on the fact that African Americans had been lynched, right? These sort of major research that had been handed down from Ida B. Wells to Du Bois, to the Civil Rights Congress. And, they're leveraging the sort of genocide language that is created in these sort of global committees, right, after World War II, to say, well, what happened there looks very similar to what's been happening here. So that's the work that I've just come out with Bill. We have another sort of follow-up edited volume that we're working on with AK Press to that book. That should be out sometime. Sometime.
That would be the signature word of a publishing
Sometime.
world. So what's so interesting to me, there are lots of interesting things in what you said, of course, but just thinking of it in the Black Studies context, and that, sort of pair of questions, right? One, sort of how does that work fit in the field, but also push new horizons? You mentioned, so much of what you've been talking about is so intensified in the Bay Area, right? I think the California project of Black Studies is important for exactly the reasons you've outlined. But that, the figures that you've named across this are absolutely canonical to Black studies, but the questions you're asking are different. So it's like that in and pushing horizons. But also when you naming these people and sort of the source materials for this research, it also strikes me how important the multidisciplinary, antidisciplinary, however people want to put it, character of Black studies as an area study, that you're talking about pamphlets, you're talking about conference proceedings, you're talking about poetry, you're talking about the sort of theoretical stuff behind certain political activism, you're talking about international relations in that way that only Black studies in some ways can sustain that kind of research, right?
Yeah.
Only that non-disciplinary training is going to allow you to engage this. And it's not just engaging it because, Jeanelle sort of pieced together with a colleague some interesting material, but that this is, as you said, this is a central struggle actually when we look at it inside this frame of fascism, anti-fascism, is actually a central struggle in Black life. And so, it just... I know I'm just sort of making follow-up commentary and repeating so much of what you said, but I just was really struck by how your training in cultural studies and Black studies makes so much of what you're talking about possible, and how in some ways it's could only be Black studies research. It's not a history project. It's not a political theory project. It's not a literary project.
And so I'm really blessed in that regard, in that I am of a generation where I get to benefit from the existence of interdisciplinary programs, right? So I get to take interdisciplinary programs from beginning of an AA degree to a PhD. And I understand that the generations perhaps before me didn't get to benefit that, and they had to be disciplined in history or sociology of the sort. And so I've always been able
as the old person on this conversation, it did not exist when I was doing my doctorate. And I'd finished my PhD in the mid 1990s, so we're talking very recent. That this is a sort of go-to sort of set of methodologies.
And so I've always had the kind of freedom to imagine how I do research and write in a very dynamic way that wasn't as disciplinary rigid, right? I would say by and large, I was trained by mostly historians. And so I sort of lean mostly towards doing social and cultural history. And yes, my bachelor's is in history and Africana studies. So even when I'm studying history, I'm doing it in a very interdisciplinary way. So I lean towards historical methods. But at the same time, while I'm in the archive, I'm going through archives of poetry pamphlets. And so that requires me to sort of engage with these materials beyond just a sort of historical analysis. It becomes a cultural analysis, right? And then not only are these poetry pamphlets, but this is an expression of political thought in education. When we're reading Sonia Sanchez, when we're reading, Janice Midikitani's work, right? And so you also read them through that when you're reading Langston Hughes. So you read them through that kind of eye as well. And so I've always had my own sort of mixed methods approach to doing research. I've always been in, I'm going to community events, right? Being in spaces, going to, city council meetings to hear, about gentrification of particularly Black and AAPI communities, and trying to connect this to those histories of that space and community making. And so all these sorts of pieces of sort of how we do research really animate my work. And a lot of it has come from the fact that, I wasn't disciplined in the type of way where I was told you got to do your research has to be solely archivally driven, or have oral histories. I do use oral history. I do use I go to the archives quite a bit. I love doing archival research, but that's not the only way that we tell this history. And I realized very early on, I didn't want to do history with a capital H, right? And I was fine. I had a little bit of a struggle with that for a year or two, but then I was like, nah, I'm gonna tell history how I want to, because I owe it to the stories the people to do it in a way that's dynamic and that leaves room for much more nuance, but it also leaves room for me to be able to theorize. I think I got told by old history professors that we don't do theory.
Yes.
We don't do theory. We're objective, I have
Which is a great theory, by the way. I mean, it's a theory.
it's a theory. We don't do theory. We're objective. And so I hated theory for a while. And then I got into Black study space and they were like, nah, like this is what, we theorize, right? Because it's not always about just looking and sitting within the past, right? I also like to bring my work to the present.
Yeah.
I don't just write linearly. I don't believe we live linear lives. And so, yeah, my journey has very much informed my approach. And that, yes, a project like the one that I mentioned, it exists because of this sort of mixed methods approach. And then also just being open to learning, right? I think that's something that I'm even sitting with now in my current project. So
I think that's an underplayed part of
yeah,
being a Black Studies scholar and researcher is the way curiosities are just a part of intellectual life.
yeah,
And, it's curiosities with a price, right? You have to buy new books. You have to figure out how to read
we
them. You have to figure out
do.
how to talk about them. But
Oh my gosh.
I always think, didn't we get into didn't we go do PhDs because we love reading?
You
So
love reading. You love reading and you love learning.
I would hope so. But let me ask you, as part of because you kind of walked up to, I think, this question a number of times. And so as part of the sort of final two questions, I'm interested in how, when you think about the history of the field of Black Studies, what you think the field has done well. But I'm also interested what you think it has not done particularly well.
I think that's a good question. We've celebrated now over 50 years of Black studies. I think what we have certainly done well is work to institutionalize the discipline within particularly higher education. Increasingly, had been successful efforts. I think, obviously we're seeing shifts now have been made to institutionalize the discipline within sort of K through 12 level and making it more accessible to high school, middle school students, right? I think that type of work is definitely important. Essentially, we're a discipline from the ground up. We will always be one of the younger disciplines that exists. And so I think we've done that particularly well in terms of creating community, journals, rigorous research. There are really dynamic studies that exist. Being able to build out Black studies and see it show up in podcasts and museums, referenced, sort of writ large. I think that is really great. Um, I think what we haven't done so well, and it's what comes at the expense of working to institutionalize a discipline, is that, or institutionalize the field, excuse me, is that there has been such a focus on, this is the field, and trying to replicate those structures that exist within higher education is come at a cost of the community engagement, right? I know there are some really great Black studies scholars that, really aim to be community engaged, meaning that they are doing work that's informed by their communities. They're in their communities helping to organize whatever the efforts are, that they are student driven. They're listening to what the student movements are on campus. There are some folks that do that work. But by and large, I think a lot of our sort of community driven nature is kind of gets lost in this sort of churn to be within sort of academia. And so I think that's something that we do need to dig deeper in, especially in this moment here.
And in that way, this is, what you said is a like a characterization and I don't want to say criticism. That's all. I mean, it's fine for any field, especially very young fields, to do things well and not so well. But what's interesting about that characterization of accomplishment and things, that the field hasn't done particularly well, is how much that's actually just the origins of Black studies still speaking to us, right? I've really been, the idea that, Africana studies at University of Maryland, where I teach, goes away is just an atrocious idea. I mean, It's just politically violent.
Yeah.
So absolutely institutionalization, but of course Black studies was, and that's what Black studies demanded, not just asked for, but demanded. Sometimes like Cornell at the end of a rifle. But also it had another set of imperatives that you've spoken to across this podcast that we struggle with. I'm just happy whenever this podcast sort of comes back to this question back to the field that you just had, that is indigenous to the field. It doesn't come from the outside. So I think it's a great imperative and sort of moral question for us in the field to all think about. And maybe then that is an answer of sorts to the final question I had for you, which is, what is the issue in the context of Black studies? What's the issue you would want us to all be thinking about, or what's the question you would want us to all be asking?
Yeah.
And you get special prize if you only have one. Everybody always has 3 or 4.
So I'll frame my question through, I've been sitting with Fred Moten's The Undercommons for like a year and a half, in part because I was working on some side article. But this idea of what does it look like to continue the work of Black studies in a new sort of iteration of the Undercommons is one that I've been sitting with. And what does it look like to do this work in this moment, and be subversive, right? I think in working within institutions that are being challenged in a multitude of ways, our discipline will have to be subversive. And we've always been to a degree, but what does it look like in this moment, right? So what does it look like to return to those undercommons, right? Not saying that we hide or anything like that, but how do we continue to stay engaged? How do we continue to be community driven? How do we continue to do the really robust work, and maintain the wins that we had and build upon them in this moment in those undercommons, while simultaneously doing the work in a way that is subversive? So that's what I've been sitting with, in both my sort of scholarship, but also in my more public-facing work as well.
I love that. This is a great place to wrap up, and also point people back to Fred's contribution to the series. And that I had that in the back of my head. I was like wondering how much you had thought about the undercommons, given so much of what you were talking about in this conversation. So I love that it comes back to that in that particular way. So. And thank you so much for this contribution to the series. This has been fantastic. There's so much here for people to think about. I'll make a link to the anti-fascism book, which I think is fantastic. A fantastically important project. I ordered it a couple weeks ago, and and so I appreciate your time, but your thoughtfulness and your seriousness in this conversation is just exemplary of Black studies, and really will push all of the people who listen in to think really hard about really foundational questions in the field. So thank you in a really deep way for your contribution.
Thank you and Ashley so much for this work. As I mentioned at the top, Black Studies is home. And so I am always elated to see folks that shine a light on the field, and the amazing work that comes out of it. So thank you both.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. I'll pass it on. I know they'll make her day. Well, have a great rest of your day, and take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.